From its earliest incarnations, then, the university was a site of conflict and expressed its conflicts plainly. It was subject to external determining agents for its curriculum and its context, at the same time as it insisted on its independence in terms of internal arrangements. Since this time, the university has remained both a site for radical social critique and a training ground for established professions, serving external dominant interests and at the same time staging opposition to those interests. So we might reasonably argue that the university has never really seen harmony between its professed ideals and its practice, its orienting concepts of self-governance and self-determination, and the administration or implementation of those concepts. The university, as a formal, administered social institution, has always served the interests of those in power. But the university, as an idea and a process or experience, has tended to fight against those interests, insisting on its freedom. So this tension or paradox that's at the heart of the university can be traced in many ways throughout the history of the university, and it appears again most notably probably in Kant's The Conflict of the Faculties, where Kant was actually trying to justify the existence of the university to the king at this time. And he dutifully and repeatedly recognizes that the university is indebted to the king, to its political context, and makes the case for the university as a site for social and government training, and yes, it must do public service. But at the same time, he argues for the university as a site for freedom of thought and inquiry. He attempts to defend both the academic freedom embodied by what he calls the lower faculty of philosophy and the usefulness of knowledge imparted by the higher faculties of law, medicine, and theology. The higher faculties have the job of caring for men's civil, physical, and spiritual well-being and are necessarily under the influence and sway of the government. But the lower faculty of philosophy has the job of policing truth and illuminating reason. Whoops, I'm missing a page here. I am missing a page. Oh, well. And so he goes on to make the claim that without the lower faculty, whose job it is to actually explore the parameters of knowledge and to explore what we think of as reason, then the higher faculties, that would be to their detriment, and that we need to always hold open a space where we can actively interrogate the parameters through which we're defining what constitutes rational action. And so on it goes, this tension, this paradox, throughout the history of the university into the early part of the century when and the latter half of the 20th century, which saw the mass expansion of higher education throughout North America and Europe. Now, at this time, there had been this push more and more towards the more instrumental orientation of the university, that it should serve industry, that it should produce human capital, that it should credentialize a workforce, all of these tropes that we're now overly familiar with. And at the same time, of course, is functioning ideologically to entrench the inevitability of liberal democratic capitalism or post-Fordist capitalism. And this has become sped up more and more through the 20th century. In the latter half of the 20th century, we saw the mass expansion of higher education. This was something that started to happen in the 50s and 60s. Higher education participation rates grew from 5% in the early part of the 20th century to 50% today, or approximately. This expansionist push, which emerged culturally and politically in the 50s and 60s, was originally motivated by this kind of liberal ideals of democratic access. But in the 70s, these ideals were increasingly being challenged as the economy started to crash. People started to think, oh, well, this is a frippery. This is nothing, this is not really important. And university enrollment slowed, and unemployment grew. And at the same time, accompanying this was public faith in what a university was for. And of course, we can talk about variability in the orienting idea of the university. But at that time, the way it was sold in mid-century, 20th century was as a purveyor of culture, as producing good citizens. This was the kind of language that was being used to frame a university education at that time, which was always tentative at best. That view started to wane. And from the 70s on, we can start to see us on this downward slide to where we are now. Canada, for example, saw a 40% decline in support for higher education funding between 1965 and 1971. So that's a huge decline in a short period of time. And at this time, government officials began to demand increased fiscal accountability on the part of universities, or as Paul Axelrod has written, more scholar for the dollar. Of course, these changes have to be understood in the context of neoliberal governmental policies and the rise of the knowledge economy, and I think that Mike is probably going to talk more about that. But these are processes that took root in the 70s and have just gained steam. And just to quickly talk about neoliberalism, and this is a quote from David Harvey, proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong property rights, free markets, and free trade. The role of the state, of course, is to advance and protect these freedoms through deregulation, privatization, and reduced social welfare benefits. Individual responsibility under neoliberalism is stressed, while communitarian or state-run social or cultural initiatives are discouraged. And perhaps most importantly, under neoliberalism, market exchange is seen as an ethic in itself, he writes, and it works to undermine or displace all previously held ethical beliefs. So when we talk about what is a public good and what constitutes the public, what we have now, what we're working against, is an incredibly narrowed understanding of what constitutes good. What is good is what is economically good, and that is all we're allowed to say. Anything else is pushed outside of discourse, and I'll come back to this. Under these conditions, institutions and services which had previously been seen to be necessary as a public good, such as healthcare or education, are penetrated with market logic. So then it becomes, all of a sudden, education is a commodity. You know, we're service providers, all of this stuff, you're all overly familiar. But penetrated by these logics of competitiveness and productivity. And as Michael Crow, who is really an unbelievable proponent of this, used to be at Columbia, now is president of some other school, I can't remember. This is tied to this idea that knowledge is a commodity, and we're in a knowledge economy. And is since the knowledge enterprise, and this is his words, is a form of venture capital. So basically all that we're doing in terms of producing research and in terms of producing even skilled workforce as through our teaching, we're producing forms of venture capital, and the university then sits at this privileged relation in terms of the knowledge economy, and it has a privileged kind of relationship. It's on the inside. So the university is now firmly and cozily situated in the intersection of the state and the market. Like all snuggled up in there, looking to get goodies from either one. An enthusiastic participant in this blurring of the boundaries between the public and the private sector, so that we don't even really know what we're talking about anymore when we talk about what is the public good or what is the public sector. So some of the fallout from this, and I'm going to just bing through these. Systematic and chronic underfunding of public education. Federal funding for post-secondary education in Canada dropped from 0.5% of GDP in 1983 to 0.19% in 2004. Universities are pushed into the arms of the private sector and external corporate sponsorship, and tuition fees start rising to meet the shortfall. Tuition fees accounted for 36% of university revenue in 2005, up from just 13% in 1980. Indeed, the University of Waterloo now collects more money from student fees and corporate donations than it does from the province and the federal government. And this is one of the contradictions that I think we really need to start to highlight. Like, they can't have it both ways. You can't say you're a public institution at the same time underfund you to the point where you are no longer a public institution, but still hold you accountable when it suits them and not when it doesn't, you know, to sort of push their agenda when they want and not when they don't. Corporate presence, as I don't have to tell you, is felt everywhere on campus, naming rights to buildings, restricted forms of technology and software, sponsorship of sports teams. The universities shifts then its research and pedagogical emphasis to those fields likely to produce the highest monetary yield, and this brings us to the situation in the UK. So this is business, computer technology, sciences, and engineering, and the humanities are left to wither. This recent report, the Brown Report in the UK, where people are now occupying and protesting over, suggested cutting all state funding for the arts and humanities. All of them. All the money that goes to teaching arts and humanities gone. 100% cut. The argument being that degrees in these fields don't pay off in terms of human capital. Or provide an appropriately skilled workforce. That's the logic. Once you start to follow this logic, then that's what you get. You get mission-oriented, commercially oriented research that's being pushed on us. SSHRC wants to only fund programs that have business orientation. A federally commissioned expert panel suggests that innovation be added to the traditional duties of the professoriate alongside teaching, service, and research. That's a recent one. And that our ability to commercialize and monetize our research should be considered when we're up for tenure. We get an increase of managerialism. Of course, the managerial administrative workforce in the universities has grown, far outstripping any hiring of the professoriate. Students come to see themselves as sovereign consumers. They have this idea that they should get what they pay for. I always joke about it's the cafeteria model of the university. Would you like fries with your A? And there's pressure on profs to inflate grades because they're beholden to student evaluations. You all are probably familiar with this. The increased branding and marketing and promotion of universities. University of Maryland spent $5 million on a branding campaign last year. Western is about to start on. That's a huge amount of money because they have to compete with each other. So we have to, given all of this, and I'm going to just sum up, we have to really start to rethink how we speak about the university as an institution right now. Obviously, its paradoxical mission, is the lever that Derrida talks about, is seriously crippled. The lower faculty is being eviscerated. It's completely, as the more and more corporate research and money on campus, we become research and development arms of corporations. And students, as I said before, bear the brunt. And this is the argument that needs to be made. They're being shafted. We're all working harder for less money. They get less quality education. They pay more for it, and they're bought off on this idea that they're a sovereign consumer and they're making rational free choice. But it's not, and I think this is the place we have to go. So just quickly, I want to just say a few demands. Demand the adequate funding of higher ed and a reduction in tuition fees. Demand a fuller concept of what constitutes public responsibility. Values such as wisdom, not just knowledge. Respect for diversity and difference. Critical judgment, tolerance, social justice, environmental sustainability be part of what we see to be the public good. Point out that provincial governments can't have it both ways. They either fund us fully or they stop calling us public institutions. And point out that how students' education is being cheapened and degraded. Demand that you play a meaningful role in your own education, that students, faculty, and staff be given a meaningful role in governance, which I didn't even get a chance to touch on, but is perhaps the most important fallout from this, is the way in which we've all been marginalized in the running of the university. Reach out and form coalitions with other groups. And recently in Quebec, I don't know if you saw this, they formed, student groups and labor groups formed something called the Social Alliance. And it's a new initiative to try to stop the right-wing agenda out there. And don't be afraid to speak out and fight back.